Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion here with all these. It's amazing how many composers are here. This is unbelievable. Well, welcome everyone, and I'm so excited. We've already had a concert last night with four of the composers here, and maybe let's start with that. Nina, how do you feel?
Elated. It was such a marvelous experience. Before the concert last night, I was talking to a friend, and they were like, "Oh, are you excited?" And I said, "You know, I had the most beautiful experience at the dress rehearsal. Everything that I wanted to happen and have this kind of musical communion between the musicians and the composition and maestro and everything. It was so wonderful." And I said, "The concert, whatever, it's fine." And then the concert happened, and it was brought to yet another level, and I realized that was because it wasn't just sharing between us here, we got to share it with everybody in the hall. So this beautiful dream that came true got to be expanded, and that was a really profound experience.
Cool. And Helen, I know that your piece, you've heard your piece several times now, right? And with different artists as well performing. How does it feel to keep coming back to the piece? You know what I mean? Like, how does it, because now you already kind of know what to expect, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a lot of, that can happen, right? Things change. And
It's really exciting, and you know, it's a huge kind of joy and honor for a composer to get repeat performances and to be able to hear a piece go through changes and transform, and to still, you know, for it still to have life, even though I wrote it eight years ago now. And so, you know, coming to this performance today, the last time I heard the piece, I was at a performance of it was in January, and this was completely different. And that's really exciting to me, that you and Leela and all the musicians here bring their own personality to the work, and it had, I think, a really special, very intense energy last night. It was kind of very on the edge of your seat, but it was intimate as well. So yeah, it was very, very special, and yeah, fantastic experience.
cool. And, you know, I'll make a little parenthesis before I come back to Karim and Vivian. Lembit, because, you know, talk about individual personalities. You know, you wrote a cello concerto for someone very special to you. And how does that, because what I've noticed and I love in the rehearsal process, you differ so much to Karen, you know, about like, is this good for you? Is this okay? You know, like, it's so sweet actually to notice just the human interaction between the two of you, of course, not just the composer-soloist interaction, in a way that, do you want to talk about the piece? And
Sure. Karen is my wife, so I wrote it for this cello concerto for her. And I think it's an interesting thing with music, because we're often stuck between these two things of wanting to be very precise and wanting to have a lot of control over what we're doing, because we're sort of asked to do that by the music world, where, you know, we're always asked, oh, is that note enough sharp? Is it F? Do you want it mezzo forte? Do you want it forte? We need to have answers to these sorts of things, because people are taking time to play our music and want to know what we think. But on the other hand, music is, no matter what sort of music, is ultimately collaborative. And I think part of being a young professional composer is figuring out how to balance those two things in our own work. And I think for me, it's amazing to work on it so closely with someone I live with, because we've had this chance to go through a lot of the questions ourselves and she asks me things, I ask her things. And with any piece, at some point it becomes not quite your own. Like Helen was talking about, a piece that's 8 years old, it's okay for it to become its own in the world. You want a lot of control over the premiere because you've had all the ideas, but that letting it go is a very, I think, important thing. And working so closely with Karen, it's at a point where I'm happy to let it go. I always feel like in any sort of collaboration, what I want, if someone has a really strong opinion about something, that's what I want to honor. You know, if I have it, then I want to honor that, but if other people have it, go with that and figure out how things work around that, and allow the piece to become something in the moment, not just something, you know, that we on a CD, but something that happens in the moment with audience and with people.
And you said something to me, I hope you don't mind that I share with everyone in the world, but you said something to me about these really intricate, cool rhythms that are very, very fast. And you said that Karen was just improvising at home, and she was just showing, oh, I could do this. And you were like, you know what, let's put it in the concerto, right?
Yes, and there's, you know, as often happens is when you play something freely, and naturally, it's more complicated than one realizes. And, you know, some of what I did then was, there was a back and forth with Karen and me, and I recorded it, and I notated some of what she was playing. And then I sort of took from that and wrote more. But looking back at what was notated, and when Karen came back to it a year later, there was sort of a moment of, wait, what is going on? Because there's a level of complexity that just emerges. You know, if you've ever tried to transcribe a jazz solo, you know what that's like, because there are all these subtle details of shading and unexpected things about timing that that emerge when you're playing freely. So being able to try to capture in a piece of notated music that sense of being free, have that connection to improv is really important, but sometimes makes things a little harder to perform.
Yeah, I love that idea, actually, that the freedom of improvisation can result in something quite a bit more complex than what we think about as we are. Because perhaps, I don't know, Karim, how do you feel about, you know, when you're writing, you're also trying to write with the practicality in mind of other people having to perform the music, right?
Yeah, and I think it sort of works in the other direction as well. I mean, one can write something that looks fairly simple on the page, and the performer can add detail to it that if one were to transcribe it would end up looking much different. So yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, for my piece, which was a premiere, it was, the most interesting thing to me about premieres is that, you know, when you're hearing the music for the first time that really only existed in your head before, and maybe to a certain extent on the piano, and you're hearing it in real time, which is 10, 20, 30 times faster than you actually wrote it, you're getting a sort of a fire hose of information as it comes to you, and you're having to process all of these things at once, and it's kind of fun, and it's also a little overwhelming, especially when, you know, you hear all of this music that you've been working on, in some cases for months, and then, you know, someone stops and says, viola, you know, measure, you know, should this be a G? That was the last thing I was thinking about when this was just, I have no idea. But that's what's fun about it, you know. You get to experience it for the first time, and then see, you know, you're making all these evaluations in your head. That worked well. That didn't work as well. This, you know. So I appreciate the opportunity to have that kind of collaboration and dialogue with the performers and the soloists.
Karim shared with me after the concert that he was really excited because he had the first whoop that he received after the performance.
I did have a whoop. I had a whoop. Yes, I'm going to try to bottle that whoop and bring it around with me.
The first of many
other concerts.
To come.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Vivian, how about you? How did you feel?
It was, you know, my host family, Nora, asked me before the concert, how do you feel? Do you have the jitters? What is it? And so I was, you know, I took a step back, and actually it felt different this time. And I think the reason why it felt different was because there's something about this festival. We were talking about this during the composers conductors class session, that there is a level of respect for composers here that is really unique and actually quite rare, I have to say. And I really feel here a sense of belonging, a special sense of belonging that I don't feel elsewhere. And I took a step back from Nora and said, yeah, I have the jitters, but I feel really good because there's such a level of trust that I have in Christy and the orchestra, and there's this one particular trumpet lick in my piece in the middle, and I can see that she was still practicing it, and trying to figure it out because it's not the easiest lick. And she was still trying to get it during the rehearsal, and I was like, I was wondering, will she get it? But she nailed it, And so it's like, one of these things where, a lot of times I am nervous because you don't feel like, they're gonna put their best forward. But with this festival, it's the opposite. It's really, really very humbling and very, just the best feeling. So thank you.
My pleasure. So talking about all of us feeling like, are we gonna get that lick, Iván? Because Iván wrote an unbelievable piece that I absolutely adore, but it's not an easy piece, right? Do you want to tell us about
Ever so slightly. I think all the performers have been, sort of sleeping in their chairs because it's so easy. No, it's actually a very, very complicated piece. But it sort of ended up being that way because I came here 2 years ago and they also played another very hard piece titled A Metaphor for Power for those who were here. And when I received this commission, it was sort of, I've played in orchestra for 10 years, and it's sort of like a different feeling for you when you're performing something that it's, that you're contributing something to the overall. So my approach, besides the emotional aspect or the narrative that the piece requires, I wanted every person in the orchestra to feel that they were doing something that was quintessential and needed for the piece, and it requires of me to delve into each instrument deeper and understand what they're doing in a deeper way, but then it ends up being collaborative work that, I don't know, they just throw themselves in a different way, because they know each have something that they need to nail perfectly.
Yeah, but it's a really, really powerful and strong piece. I'm actually surprised because when I looked at the piece, I just immediately assumed that a lot of the musicians in the orchestra will be a little scared. But of course, in true Cabrillo fashion, they were just like, yes, like they go for the piece, like, okay, this is it, we can do this. Put on the seatbelts, and we go this way. Nathaniel, this is your first time in Cabrillo.
Yes, yeah.
Right, and how does it feel to be here?
It feels great. Yeah, I feel very welcome here. As a composer, it's hard to gain trust between the musicians and the music, and I felt like I could trust the musicians on stage with my music after the first rehearsal. I've never met a group of people who are so passionate about contemporary music. I just finished music school, and it's safe to say that not everyone is on the same foot as us when it comes to contemporary music. I mean that in regards to the players, but everyone on stage, I can tell, really loves what they're doing here, and it makes a huge difference in the music, the energy and enthusiasm. So it's been great. Yeah.
I'm so happy to hear that, and your piece is very beautiful as well.
Thank you.
It's also a world premiere tonight.
That's correct, yeah.
This composition, yeah. Daniel.
Yes.
Okay, so your piece is probably the in terms of the scope and the length and everything for tonight's concert is probably the meatiest, so to speak. How do you? I'm always fascinated actually, and I want to know from composers how do you choose length, or like how do you choose to make a statement? That is this grand and this big. Like, do you think about that beforehand, or is it something that emerges as you're composing?
I think for myself, I almost always think about the form beforehand. And in this case, it's about the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And when I contemplated the totality of that and the impact it had, it led me to a 3-movement structure, and each movement had its own sort of weight. And it is a big piece because that was what sort of canvas I needed to capture my thoughts, my reflection upon this. So, yeah.
Cool. And did you have a time, to the three movements, or the reason why I'm asking is, because there are some people that plan, sort of these are the motifs, and I'm going to do this, and there are some people that compose. Like Iván was telling me, well, I was stuck, and then at this moment I was listening to something, and then it felt like, okay, this is what I need to do next. And I think other people are like, okay, we're gonna do this, and in the structure, this is coming back, that's going, and then it's all just sort of pre-planned this way. What's your
I don't do a lot of detailed planning of the structure in advance, but I often have a program that I'm working with in a piece, and you'll see later that each movement has a very distinct thing it's trying to capture about this commemoration of the Transcontinental Railroad. So I knew what I wanted to do in each movement and sort of the general shape of it, but I think I had sort of agreed with the commissioning orchestra on a 25-minute piece, and I think it's probably like a 28-minute piece. And that's within the margin of error, if we're all thinking about margins of errors these days. But the middle movement ended up being bigger than I imagined, because for me it's the sort of the heart of the piece. It's where my feelings really lie about the subject matter, and it just needed a bit more time, and I discovered that when I was writing. Although I'm still thinking, well, could I shave off a minute? And as composers, we're always thinking those things.
Well, we have a couple hours before the concert.
All right, I'll get right to work.
And Greg, yes, welcome. Now, your piece is on a very, very special concert. Actually, I don't have favorite concerts, but because it's so important for my kids and they love hearing those concerts. Do you want to tell us about your piece a little bit, and how was your process of coming up with it?
Okay. Hi, everybody. I just had we started a run-through before this, so I had a chance to say a quick word to the orchestra, and it's really true. I've been here a number of times, and I've cherished every visit, and the older I get, the more I cherish the originals. And honored to be on this panel with all these talented composers, and my first panel was with Lou Harrison. He was on it. So I have a little bit of history here, and which I'm grateful for, and I cherish. I think I mentioned that. The piece we're doing tomorrow is called Vibe, and it's the only one of my pieces, actually, the full-length pieces that has not been done here. And I wrote it 5 years or so ago. It uses the STEAM system of education, if you're familiar with that. Science, technology, engineering, arts, math. And it incorporates the science of sound with music. What better thing to demonstrate the principles of sound than an orchestra? And it, like all of my educational concert works, it tries to hide the educational value. Oh, well, good. That's funny already. That's good. And because I don't want them to think it's a class. And the burden of Vibe, because it involves science, there was two burdens. First of all, I had to get my science right, because all these science teachers out there are going to say, no, the speed of sound is actually... But I also, it's a lot of information. So to capsulate the information and bring it down to earth as much as possible while demonstrating music and doing things like that was a bit of a challenge. And what I just heard today in the brief rehearsal sounded pretty good to me. I've enjoyed it. There's a lot of audience participation that is integral to the performance of the piece. Ultimately, the audience, many kids here, even sings. And it's very rewarding for me to do these pieces. And very often I come off stage, I think, well, who was the performer and who was the audience? And that's a good thing for the kids that come to the educational concerts. So I appreciate you embracing the piece.
Yes, I love the idea that these are the concerts that I get to act a little bit in. I have a little bit of a history of narrating stuff and acting here as well on those concerts.
Are we going to get along okay tomorrow then?
I'm sorry?
Is you challenging me now?
No, not at all, not at all. Wonderful. Well, I would love to see if there are any questions that you have for anybody on the panel, and hopefully we can answer them. Mark. Okay, so the two questions are, the first one for the composers, if they have worked writing for dancers or for the ballet. And then the second question for me was, did I work with a ballet and have to adjust the tempi to suit what's possible? So I will answer the second question quickly because it immediately reminded me of a story with the great Maestro Savalish with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and they did a recording of the Swan Lake. And at the first session of the recording, he walked on stage and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so happy to finally do this piece without the limitations of the dancers." Because the reality is, of course, the music has to serve the stage. And that is very clear, I think, for a conductor. And those that do not do that, it just, it does not help to tell the story. It doesn't help the dancers. I mean, they should be allowed to feel comfortable telling the story and doing everything. So yes, when I have collaborated, with a ballet troupe, it's always fascinating to me because it's also different the way that you understand the rhythm, because they count differently. It's not in the same way that we think in musical phrases and in musical rhythms. And also it begins at different times in a weird way. So they don't always land on one, and sometimes like, well, I'm landing here. And I'm like, yeah, but for me, that's a pickup, So it's always a little bit strange, but it's a really fun challenge. And I think it's really wonderful to be able to have the marriage of the two. But who has collaborated with dancers on the panel? Lembit.
Yeah, not a lot, but a little bit. And I think the things that I love are the things that are similar and then the things that are different. And there is this approach in dance that's very similar to composing, thinking about motive, gesture, and then expansions of that is something that's very natural for dancers. Come up with a gesture, do it again, flip it around. But then this point that you were talking about was counting. The joke I remember used to be, how do dancers count to 7? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, which of course is actually 8. But
conductors do that as well.
Yeah, but I actually think it's really useful with any sort of other field was to understand how people are thinking about time. This is a time-based art, and just because we have on the page a certain way of thinking about time with Western notation doesn't mean that's the only way. And I think dancers can unlock a lot for us. I remember working with an opera director, a little different than dance, but who didn't read music, but was amazingly musical. And the thing, I was like looking at my score like this, and she was always looking up. And she kept turning to me and saying, "Why are they making that face?" Or that, bringing out these details that I was sort of about timing of things that was very much about her looking at the singers. And I think working with dancers, working with directors, with any other field can open you up to these things, particularly time-based things that we sort of aren't paying attention to because we have such a fixed way of thinking about meter and about rhythm.
I have, in my experience working with 2 choreographers, it opened up a new dimension of thinking about space and architecture, and it changed the way I compose my music. Because when you're collaborating with dancers, yes, time is different. I have a different version, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, instead of the 7 that you talked about. But yeah, we have similar ways of communicating, and they mean very different things. And when the dancers are moving around in a space, they're embodying this other dimension that we actually have in music too. And the fact that you could take a motive and move it from left to right, upstage, downstage, really sort of opens up this new thing for me, and that I really enjoy when working with the orchestra, because now when I'm working with the orchestra, I think not just about a musical motive in time, but I think about how can I pass that sound throughout the entire space? How can it start on the left of the stage and then swirl around over here and there? And for me, that's been a really exciting part of my compositional language in the last decade, and I'm like really interested in seeing where that could move next.
So does that throw you off if you go to like a European orchestra and the setup of the strings is opposite of each other?
Yes, I have some pieces where I actually want that hocketing and other times when I don't. And so when I'm composing, I try to say, okay, what happens if it moves around and is that okay? If not, I have to be very strict with my stage diagram, which
Yeah.
for orchestra doesn't matter.
But it's, you know, it's very interesting. If you, so the context that I'm talking about is the fact that in different countries, there are unique setups to the orchestra. So for example, in Vienna, which is what we call the Viennese setup, you would have the first violins where they are, and you have the second violins on the opposite side where our celli are sitting. And then next to the first violins, you would have the cello. And then next to the second violins, you would have the viola. And sometimes you have the basses either behind the first violins or you have them behind the orchestra itself. And then in front of them are the brass and winds and stuff. So it's always a discussion, actually, because some composers, you know, like the composers in French repertoire, for example, and even Mahler would write stuff that begins in the first violin section. It's supposed to carry through the section. And I always make an argument when I look at this composition. I said, no, if they've written first, second, viola, cello, double bass, first, second, you know, it needs to go like this as a gesture. It can't go first, second, viola, cello, you know, because then it doesn't represent the gesture itself.
Yeah, it loses the direction of
You lose
line.
Exactly. So, yeah, that's interesting. Has anyone, yeah.
I've worked with dancers and choreographers as well, and I think I agree with all that you've mentioned, but also the collaborative aspect. As composers, we're like in our own world, in our little office with pen and paper and writing, and we have like fixed ideas, and whenever we try to pull down the sound from the ether and encode it on the paper, that's when it ended and we move to the next thing. But when you're dealing with choreographers and dancers, they are also creating there. So sometimes they need more time, sometimes they need your phrase to end up earlier. So it's a very interesting, collaborative, and eye-opening process and humbling process, because you need to go there when you are creating with them with your mind open that whatever you put on there, it's open to change. You need, if you deliver the phrase that is important to you, you need to know that there could be some changes there, and it needs to serve them as much as it served your idea of what you wanted to communicate.
Beautiful. Yes.
Thank you. Just picking up on this discussion about time and rhythm and improvisation, I wanted to ask you, Christy, or Karim, about the drum beats that were happening with the two drummers, the Doombeck, and what I would call maybe a street rhythm. And I wondered how you annotated that, if you allow for improvisation, and how you can infuse that movement and rhythm into the orchestra as we go forward.
Karim.
Okay. Well, in the main, it's used in a couple of movements, but it's mainly in the third movement. And they're actually playing a very typical rhythm called the malfouf, which is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And they play that essentially all the way through. And the rest of the orchestra, of course, is doing other things, and that rhythm is sort of grafted in a way onto everything else that the orchestra is playing. So there isn't, in that aspect, there isn't that as much improvisation. It's more of a kind of a layering thing that's happening. But then later in the piece, there is a solo for the darbuka, which Doombeck is the same instrument, where I essentially just give them the sort of metric framework, and then they improvise within that. So the idea, anyway, for the piece was, yeah, to infuse this kind of, it's a very old pattern that you hear in, there are maybe half a dozen of these patterns that you hear in Arabic music, and that's one of the most common ones, is the malfouf. You know, so to have that sort of reference point, but then have it almost as a backdrop or sort of behind all of the other colorful things I was trying to do in the orchestra, which actually involved another ostinato, you know, in the lower strings and other instruments kind of happening underneath it. So that was the plan there.
Yeah, and as in terms of the notation, so you're writing it just the same way that you would write for any percussion instrument. right?
Yes.
So it's, and the way that it works with notating percussion instruments, very typically it'll be notated at the beginning of the staff or at the beginning of the score, and it'll be, okay, on the staff, on this line is that instrument, the next line is that instrument on this, and then, you notate it like it's like any other instrument except it's non-pitch, and each line and each space refers to an instrument, and then they have the rhythms that are the same for the whole orchestra. Which is why there was one moment where nothing was lining up with what I had in the score, and I stopped in rehearsal and I said, Svet, I'm not sure. And Svet was like, I was improvising. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Like for me, that was, I didn't have anything written down this way, so I didn't know that he was going to improvise on this.
Yeah, I was going to say the other interesting thing about any kind of, using folkloric elements in music is that, you're forced to remember that as a composer, the score, which we're so used to kind of getting into in detail and focusing on, the score is not the music. The score is the recipe to make the music, right? And so, when a lot of musicians who play, folkloric music, they don't necessarily read music. So it's always something of a compromise to sort of put it to paper in that way. So I suppose, the ideal would be having musicians who are kind of used to playing this repertoire coming in to address your point about improvisation. In a real piece of, folkloric music, you wouldn't necessarily play the same thing in the malfuf. You would embellish it, right? So that's the kind of the next level. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I asked Christy this question last night, so I wanted to open it to the panel. If you think of yourselves as musicians, composers, and incubators, what would you like to see in this new era coming up in classical music, contemporary classical music, and how could there be possibly, or are you interested in collaborations with other genres of music, and how do we attract a younger audience? Three questions.
Big questions, yeah.
Helen, do you want to start?
I don't know where to start really, but yeah, what was the first part again? Would you say?
Incubators, and how do you see the development, or what would you wish to see in the, going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think collaboration is incredibly important, and to keep engaging with what's going on around us, but also other art forms, and bringing in new audiences. I mean, it's a really tough one. I mean, orchestras and musicians and groups are constantly thinking about this, and sometimes the ideas that we may have are that they're not a quick fix. It seems like, if we incorporate, more pop music, or we create pieces that engage with other styles, maybe that will bring in new audiences, which it doesn't always happen that way. And, art which does engage with many different genres, I think is great, but I think also art which doesn't do that is just as valid, and it's really important that we keep integrity in what we're doing and in our own music, and just keep going and keep doing that, because it's a tough time, and it's a tough time for the arts everywhere, I think, and by us having that belief and keep saying what we say as well as we can possibly say it, I think that's one of the most important things we do. Of course, it's so much more complex than that, but it's a starting point, I think.
I just wanted to add to that. I think one of the most important things, at least for me, is that our relevance in our society, in our community, that music is relevant to our daily lives, and how do we make that possible? Well, I think programming is very important, that we reflect our audience in the sense of culturally, racially, experientially, that we bring as diverse a programming as the audience brings to us. And I think that's really, really important to consider. And I think gone are those days where we can just program Beethoven, you know, especially all Beethoven concerts. And it's just one of these things that I think is changing in our industry, but I think there's still a lot of work to do. The second thing is providing relevance in terms of education. I have a 9-year-old, and I can see that classical music can be on the periphery because of all the things that are so attractive to young people nowadays with social media and these 30-second video clips. So I think that arts in education is so vitally important to our society, and I cannot stress enough that I can see this in my son. You know, if we don't invest in the younger generation, then they won't grow up knowing who Mozart is or Beethoven is. And I think it's something that I really think is very important to foster. So I think these educational concerts are really important, but also just the idea of having arts in our schools is so, so important.
I wanted to add something about just the idea of what do we do as an incubator for the art form or for young people. The orchestra is one of the most magnificent instruments to have evolved, and for many composers in a Western tradition, it's sort of this dream to be able to write for the orchestra, all these people on stage, and it developed over centuries. There is such a steep learning curve in how to write for this well, whether it's just the practicalities of notation or limitations of the instrumentation, or whether it's the nuance of orchestration. And very, very few young composers in the grand scheme of things ever are actually granted access to an orchestra. And access once is like barely introduces you to the art form. And so giving young composers the chance to write, to have readings, to be writing a piece, and maybe you get to hear half of it months before the premiere so you can go back and rework it, getting a second performance. Cabrillo is known as the sort of shining beacon in the composer world, where composers get to actually come and hear their work played extremely well, get to work with players who are dedicated and willing to be flexible and bend. And so Cabrillo really is creating a magnificent incubator. I think we all probably wish there was a lot more of that, a lot more readings, and more mentorship to people that just need some guidance along those practicalities of how do you get into the orchestral world, because it's infinite the possibilities that this instrument can do, but you have to have access and opportunity.
I wholeheartedly agree with what everyone is saying, and as what we could see change in the future, that was sort of my focus in my doctoral research. There was sort of like a change in music history in the 1800s, and then it went all the way through the mid-1900s, where we sort of sublimated music to this deified space. And we forgot that music was just that, music. And I wish we could change the way we teach music in a way that we can approach the music itself with the seriousness that it requires, but also with the simplicity that it invokes with it itself. For example, when you speak of pop music, you would never say that Mexican ranchera is the same thing as doom metal from Sweden, you know? Those are different genres there are, but under a similar umbrella. Orchestral music has also a whole host of genres. And if we can teach that as what it is, as just music, that it can affect each and every person differently, but it's just that music, we won't be afraid of it. In addition to that, I don't know how much of you remember your teenage, early 20 years, where you found that record that sort of defined your life. All of a sudden, you heard someone, some artists and you're like, they are talking to me. This is my life, you know? But it was just that, pop music. So it had that meaning to you, but it was pop music. This is the same thing. It carries the meaning that we want to share, but it's just that music. So we should approach the masterpieces with the respect they require, but also just like that, they are just music. So if we teach we like pick them and drag them down to a human level and see that Brahms was as human as Nina, then we can see it in a way that expanding, inviting, and innovating won't be as apostate as some other people might see it.
Anybody else want to?
I was just going to add that the argument that I always make about, the importance of contemporary music, you often we'll see orchestras or operas going out of their way to take old classics and sort of repaint them and revarnish them to make them relevant, to make a certain character, Trumpian or another character, something else to sort of kind of bring it into the modern day. But, composers are uniquely positioned to be able to comment on what's going on right now, And so I feel like, that's one of the things that's the beauty of contemporary music. It's written by people who are living today in the same society that you are, responding to the same sorts of things that are happening to the audience. And so there's immediately that connection. You don't need to work for that. You don't need to kind of layer that on as an afterthought, right? So that sort of immediacy and that sort of direct connection to communities and to politics and to geography and to history and all of that thing, that just comes automatically when you're commissioning new music. And so I think that's kind of one of the, speaking of audiences, that's one of the easiest ways, it seems to me anyway, to bring audiences into the hall. It's like, oh, that person is like me, or they're speaking to something I'm interested in, or, and so forth. So, that to me is kind of a no-brainer in a way in terms of, generating audience interest and sort of engagement with the community.
I think also people like making sound together. I think as the decades are moving on, we're becoming, especially in the United States, more distance from everybody playing an instrument and everybody playing an instrument together. If we normalize this, if every community had a community orchestra and everybody actually played, or you got together with your friends and you had a piano and you gathered around, I don't care what kind of music you're playing, or people are going less and less to houses of worship where you sing together. This is a very therapeutic process to make music together, and it makes it commonplace. And just like we all cook at home, and sometimes we go to McDonald's and sometimes we go to a fancy restaurant, it gives us this perspective where we can feel engaged with the art directly. And if everybody was making music together, you would go to an orchestra and be like, wow, and look how they're doing that. And it would feel more directly connected with your life. I think that's the problem right now in programming, is we're losing the connection between community life, everyday life, and what happens on the orchestral stage. We as musicians, this is our life. It seems to just make so much sense to do it all the time, but I can understand how it can feel so foreign for someone who's not participating in this kind of art making on a daily basis. And I think that also starts, as Vivian said, with education. Why it's so sad that we're not having programs where every kid in elementary school is assigned an instrument and has to play anymore. That's how I came into this world. It was great.
Yeah. Yes, I think there's also a little bit of a danger. I remember the first time that I discovered the fact that there were bad people that liked the same kind of music that I did. because as a kid especially, you hear this conversation about how music is transformative and can make you a better person. And I remember being really shocked, about the fact that music alone did not do that. And I think if we remove that importance and that sort of, I think what you're talking about, Iván, as well, the fact that we are expecting music to do that. No, music is simply something that comes from within ourselves to express who we are. And then when we allow it to do its greatest thing, which is to bring us together, then we get to decide what statement we make with our community. And I think removing a little bit that importance of, oh my God, if we listen to Beethoven, we're going to be better people. We're not. We listen to Beethoven because it makes us feel good, and it's fun, and it's beautiful. And for me, it brings me on a level that is, it helps me enter into a world where emotions are what carries me through, and sentiments, and I remember people, and I remember places, and I revisit all of that. But I don't expect it anymore that it'll be what makes me a better human being. I think it's what brings us together. And then the power of being together with many people, that is something that we should channel then to create a better world.
Just to add to what all of you are saying, I think our society is so locked into achievement and test scores and numbers and Dow Jones that we lose sight of the process. And I think the beauty of, I think everybody should experience the act of creating something. Because in doing that, you get closer to what humanity is about. It's about the process of doing something and not the end result. And that is very messy, and that's not numbers oriented. But if we can all engage in that act of creation, I think the world can become a better place.
Absolutely. Yes.
I was wondering if any of you have any experience in composing with visual media in mind, and if you see any support for that in composition programs in conservatories where it's multimedia in concept. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Wellington Tempest and South African, but he does multimedia productions. And when you were asking about what you see coming in the future, I was thinking about how when we were looking for a composition school for our son, it seemed like there were so many schools that were silent. You could go to the school of film, you could go to the school of music, but it was hard for us to find a place for somebody who had a creative vision that included multimedia presentations. And I was just wondering if any of you have any experience with that, and how you see that, supporting that for somebody who has a composer who also plays film, and where do you see support for that in the future, and how we might support somebody who's got that ability?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we need to pull down from that pedestal, music from that pedestal, because usually you also have this divide in higher education between film music or, conservatories and composition, quote unquote, composition. And it's basically the same thing, writing for a ballet is the same thing that writing for film, it's just a different type of collaboration. But there is the market somehow sees it as inherently different and ascribes different values to it. So if you suddenly say you write for a multimedia approach that includes film, not necessarily movies, but film, you might be pigeonholed into like, okay, film composer maybe would never approach a symphony or, like a symphony as a form, not necessarily. And that's why, I really hope this changes. And I think, we are seeing some more innovation in our field slowly, but we are seeing it. But I wholeheartedly agree that and I've worked with visual mediums as well, and I don't necessarily see any difference from doing it, from dancing or any other collaboration. But it's the thought process, the thought process of those who are digesting it. We need to understand that approach is as serious and as musical and as worthy as just writing an opera or a symphony.
Do any of you know of specific programs that a young composer can?
Well, the USC, Nina can speak to that. The USC school has a good film scoring program, and at the San Francisco Conservatory, there's a specific program where you can generate video game music, and you compose. You learn how to do that specifically, and a lot of people graduate and get pretty lucrative jobs that way.
And it's a special skill that you need to gain in order to be able to really have it as a profession, because it's it requires a certain kind of knowledge in terms of how to understand tempo, speed, timing, space, all those things. I think are elements that one would need to learn with a different intensity than the aspect of creating the music itself. So there's a separate, right?
Yeah, I see. I teach multimedia composition. I'm no longer at USC, at the Thornton School of Music, but was developing a program there in multimedia arts specifically for composers. And you see that, I think, I am one of these people, but in the generations underneath me, an interest in what can we do with technology, what can we do with live interaction, how can the computer act as a mediator to give us more than we can just do with our hands and our eyes and our fingers. How can we augment musical instruments and or visual experiences? And I do think that this is the future. There is, as Christy was just saying, there's another skill set that one has to onboard in order to become flexible enough to express at whatever level of artistic intent you want. So it just takes more time to learn all of these skills and put them together. And in acoustic music and in electronic music already, there's a huge onboarding of skills that are necessary in craft while you're also learning how to be an artist. So this just adds to that, and it becomes a really big and interesting and awesome world to live in, and we get to always learn. So I do think that that's the future, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. There are quite a few programs in the United States and internationally that are really specialized in this kind of art making now.
Lembit, you had a point.
I was just going to mention that I think, Nick was his name, who was in the composer workshop, right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
he's
Nick,
at Brown, and I think they have a great multimedia sort of approach.
Yeah,
at
their
Brown.
entire doctoral program is about multimedia work specifically. If you don't do that, you kind of can't get in there.
And I think it is the future. I think that the difficult thing is that so often when people try to do multimedia things, it's either music with a screensaver or it's a film with some musical accompaniment. And those aren't necessarily bad things, but they often can be distracting, and getting real art that feels naturally balanced with these two things is really difficult, and I think is the future, but there's a lot to learn.
Lembit is being very humble. He has a really beautiful video practice based in stop motion filmmaking that I've been watching evolve over the last few years. And maybe you can talk about what that journey is like. You have such a high level of musicianship, and now you're doing this other thing, right? What's that journey?
It's nice to work. I do some stop motion animation, and it's nice to work with something that's physical, not just in your mind, but something that you can see acting. Another nice thing about stop motion is once you shoot a scene or get going in a scene, you can't go back. So it's nice as opposed to music where one keeps looping back and changing things. There's a little bit of a Zen practice with making that sort of video. I think the thing that's easy for me to lose and that I would hate to see lost when we are trying to produce programs and concerts and that are multimedia is just the enjoyment of sound. And I think, the earlier question about what would you like to see in the future, and for me it's just getting people closer to sound. There's nothing like hearing someone practice, in this case my wife right next door, or going to these rehearsals and sitting right in front of the orchestra. And the balance is better in the back, but seeing the visceral quality and physicality of making sound live, of acoustic sound, is the most special thing. and finding ways of combining that with dance, with visuals, with all the other things, while not sort of underplaying it or sweeping it away is a thing I'd like to see. And I think it's a difficult thing, but I think that would be a goal.
Yeah, I agree. It's the best thing about being a conductor is that you are like in the line of fire of every single, sound wave that goes towards the public goes through you first. And it's really quite remarkable. It's an intensity that I don't feel anywhere else. And it's very, very beautiful. I hope all of you get to experience that at one point or another. We have a conductor's workshop if anybody would like to apply in the future. Well, I think we have time for one more question. Yes, please. Yeah, well, I think I will quickly say that I have never heard an audience member complain because they heard from the composer before they heard the music, like nowhere in the world. And there's also, I think there's a very real element in the discussion that as an industry needs to be addressed. And yes, it always comes down to limitations on a financial level. Because I know that sounds shocking to you that understand what we do here and how we do it. Most of the time, with the exception of the world premiere, composers are not given the financial means to attend the performance of their own composition, nor invited to introduce the piece or to speak about it, which I think it's really a lost opportunity. For the audience to get closer to the music. So for me, this place remains the most special in the world because we make such a great effort in making sure that you do get to hear from the composer and you do get to see the interaction from the composer to the musicians, to the audience. But how do you all feel about presenting your music? Nathaniel?
Yeah, I mean, I used to resent having to stand up in front of the orchestra and talk about my music. I used to say to myself, I let the music speak for itself. But as I've gotten older, I realized that it's maybe like one of the most important parts about the program. I think it's important for audiences to see that composers are just people too, like everyone else. A lot of times we put composers on pedestals. But I think when you get to explain your music and build a connection between the audience, you can see that the composers are just like everyone else. Yeah, so I think it's like very important. Yeah.
I jump at the chance to connect with an audience in whatever way is possible. I mean, sometimes there's opportunity to do a pre-concert talk and get in some real detail. And I love doing that, but I think, yes, saying something about the piece, or even better, sometimes having like a miniature interview. I was saying to someone the other day that with the London Symphony Orchestra, they had a scheme where they were commissioning new works, but as part of that, they would get a different orchestra member to interview the composer. So it was kind of coming from the musician's perspective as well, and that's fantastic. I think it brings lots of different perspectives. But yeah, it just really breaks down those barriers, not just for the audience, but I think for the composer, it can be very scary and overwhelming, and you see all of these faces and you think, oh, you know, we feel very vulnerable. So to be able to connect in some way, and you never know what it is you might say that you know, might just spark something in an audience member's imagination and really help to connect with that piece. So I think it's so important, and it's just not done enough. It would be fantastic if we could do this more and more, for sure.
Yes, so step 1, program new music. Step 2, invite composers to present it. And with that in mind, thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for being present. See you tonight at the concert.